It was meant to be a quiet morning of solemn remembrance at Crestview National Cemetery, where the magnolia blossoms danced lightly in the warm Alabama breeze. Rows of gleaming white headstones stretched into the distance, each marking the final resting place of a hero who had answered the nation's call. Hundreds of uniformed service members stood in precise formation, their polished shoes clicking softly against the gravel walkways. Veterans in worn caps and medals bowed their heads in respectful silence, while news crews hovered at the edges, cameras poised to capture every dignified moment. At the heart of it all was the casket of Captain Nicole Bryant, draped in the American flag, a symbol of sacrifice in a distant land. Among those gathered stood Brigadier General Angela Bryant, the highest-ranking black female officer to serve in the United States Air Force. Clad in her full-dress uniform, she embodied both grace and grief, her eyes fixed on the marble marker before her. She was more than a mourning mother. She was a living testament to courage and resilience. Yet no one could have foreseen that this day of honor would be hijacked by forces of bigotry and corruption. Unbeknownst to the mourners, Sheriff Brock Whitman and his hand-picked deputies lurked in the periphery. Known in hushed tones at local barbershops and on gas station benches for his cruel tactics, the sheriff had come prepared to transform a hero's funeral into his own stage for intimidation. His plan was simple yet sinister. Publicly humiliate General Bryant, cloak his actions in false charges, and fracture a family already broken by loss. They did not know, however, whom they had chosen to provoke. Angela Bryant carried within her a strength forged in both combat zones overseas seas and courtroom battles at home. She possessed a truth so powerful it threatened to expose their empire of lies. As the morning's hush gave way to the first tremors of conflict, it became clear that the real service unfolding that day would be a fight for justice, one in which honor, betrayal, and courage would collide beneath the southern sun. The spring sun filtered through the sprawling oaks, their new leaves quivering in a gentle breeze that carried the scent of magnolias and damp earth. The white marble headstones glowed in the light, and the honor guards stood with rifles poised, faces set in solemn resolve. Reporters clustered at the fringe of the ceremony, lenses trained on every gesture, every solemn tribute, ready to broadcast a story that might awaken the nation to an unbearable injustice. At the center of this scene of discipline ritual was Brigadier General Angela Bryant. She was not merely a mother broken by grief. She was one of America's most senior officers, a woman who had shattered barriers in a male-dominated institution and who now bore her loss with quiet dignity. Her uniform was immaculate, the silver braid on her shoulder reflecting the sunlight, her ribbons and medals arranged with military precision. Yet behind her composed exterior, her heart weighed heavy with the loss of her daughter. Around her, the crowd whispered words of admiration and sympathy. Veterans exchanged glances that acknowledged both her rank and her sorrow. Young airmen and airwomen, scarcely old enough to remember the wars in which Nicole had fought, stood taller in her presence, as if drawing strength from her unwavering posture. To them, she was more than a general. She was living proof that courage and compassion could coexist even in the harshest of times. But hidden behind the respectful rows and polite murmurs lurked men whose loyalty lay not with honor, but with prejudice. Sheriff Brock Whitman and his hand-picked deputies had slipped into the gathering, their faces unreadable beneath the brims of their hats. They believed they could exploit the hush of mourning to humiliate a trailblazing officer and fracture a symbol of progress. They did not know that Angela Bryant had spent decades teaching soldiers to stand firm in the face of adversity, and that nothing, not even the weight of her grief, would keep her from answering this final challenge. In that hushed April morning light, the stakes were clear. True courage would be tested, and an old order threatened to crumble under the force of a single woman's resolve. A sudden ripple of unease passed through the assembled mourners as Sheriff Brock Whitman stepped out from the edge of the procession. His tall frame, draped in a plain shirt and well-worn badge, cut an incongruous figure amid the sea of dress blues and subdued black mourning attire. Whispers had long trailed him at barbershops, at gas stations, a man whose brand of law and order masked a deep-seated contempt for anyone who defied the old social hierarchy. Yet here under Crestview's spring sky, his presence was not expected. With each measured step, his polished boots scraped the gravel, the sound slicing through the respectful hush like a butcher's cleaver. Reporters, ever vigilant for a dramatic turn, quietly raised their cameras. Others in the crowd froze, unsure whether to step forward or step back. No officer in the honor guard moved to intercept him. No hand was raised in warning. It was as though time itself hesitated, caught between the relentless march of authority and the steady calm of a grieving general. Sheriff Whitman's dark eyes locked onto Angela Bryant. He approached with a deliberate slowness, the gravel crunching underfoot, magnifying the tension. Around him, mourners glanced nervously at each other, some raising phones in tentative recording, as if reluctant witnesses to an unfolding drama. A distant bird call went unanswered. A chapel bell felt muted, its toll swallowed by the gravity of what was about to occur. In that pregnant moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The sheriff's reputation for ruthless tactics was no longer whispered rumor, it stood alive before them. And yet no one intervened. They dared not. The enormity of his unchallenged advance spoke volumes. This was a man accustomed to bending rules to serve his prejudice. The air crackled with foreboding as every soul present realized that the fragile peace of the ceremony was about to shatter. In that suspended heartbeat, Angela Bryant stood alone, a solitary figure of authority poised against the coming storm. Sheriff Whitman charged through the honor guard without hesitation, his bulk crashing into their perfectly aligned ranks like a runaway freight train. A young airman, caught entirely off guard, stumbled backward as the sheriff's shoulder bowled him aside. The soldier's ceremonial rifle clattered to the gravel, its stocks echoing against the marble monuments. In that instant, all eyes snapped to Angela Bryant. She turned astonished to see the cold steel of his service pistol gleaming at her temple. The barrel pressed uncomfortably into the delicate curve of her skull. The sheriff's finger quivered above the trigger, his breathing ragged, part rage, part excitement. Around them, the cemetery fell into a suspended hush. Reporters fumbled with cameras, capturing wide-eyed veterans frozen in shock. 100 phones lifted in unsteady hands, recording every brutal second. No one stepped forward. No one moved to defuse the moment. The weight of authority, wielded so violently, pressed heavy on every chest. Angela's jaw set her posture rigid, yet her shoulders did not slump. She did not flinch. Then Whitman leaned in, his voice low and venomous. "You think that uniform makes you special?" He snarled, lips curling into a sneer. "You think you are better than the rest of us just because you climbed through every hole in the glass ceiling?" He spat the words as if tasting them for the first time. "You're nothing, just another uppity black woman playing soldier." Each insult landed like a physical blow, exposing the deep contempt he harbored for her achievements. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Cameras flashed, mourners exhaled in dismay. The gentle breeze that had carried magnolia petals now felt cold, hostile. Here, at a ceremony meant to honor sacrifice, a twisted show of power was unfolding. Angela stood her ground, unwavering, even as his words sought to fracture her resolve. In that charged silence, the true battle, one of dignity against prejudice, had begun. "You think that uniform makes you special?" Sheriff Whitman hissed, his voice thick with contempt. He jabbed the barrel of his pistol harder against General Bryant's temple, as if testing the steel against her resolve. "You're nothing but an uppity black woman playing soldier." His words cut through the cemetery's hush like a bayonet, and for a heartbeat, every mourner held their breath. Angela Bryant's heart thundered, but her expression did not waver. She remained rooted in place, the weight of his weapon pressing on her, yet her spirit stood unbowed. Through clenched teeth, she drew in a steady breath and whispered 4 simple words that would echo across every news outlet. "Not today, not today." The repetition carried a quiet power, a refusal to be cowed by hatred or fear. In that moment, her soft voice rang louder than any gunshot. She did not reach for the sheriff's weapon. Instead, she lifted her other hand and pressed it gently against the folded flag resting on the podium before her, the same flag that had draped her daughter's casket. Its fabric, crisp and precisely creased, was more than cloth. It was the symbol of honor and sacrifice that no act of intimidation could tarnish. Angela's fingers curled around the flag's edge, as if anchoring herself to every promise it represented. Around them, the crowd seemed to inhale sharply, the shock in their eyes, transforming into something else: admiration, solidarity. Even the soldiers in the honor guard straightened their posture rifles, trembling only slightly in response to the tension. Reporters captured the exchange lenses, trained on the general's calm defiance as much as on the sheriff's rage. For the first time, Sheriff Whitman hesitated. His finger trembled on the trigger, uncertainty flickering in his cold gaze. The air between them crackled with the weight of that hesitation, a testament to the power of quiet courage. Under the spring sun in the shadow of those white headstones, General Angela Bryant stood her ground, and in doing so she ignited a blaze of resolve no act of violence could ever extinguish. No sooner had Angela's whispered defiance faded than a sharp report cracked through the crisp morning air, a single warning shot fired by Deputy Michael Lopez into the clear spring sky. The sudden blast echoed off the marble headstones, startling birds into frantic flight. Lopez's voice split the stunned silence. "She's reaching for a weapon." His accusation rang out like a clarion call, though every eye knew it was a lie. Seizing the pretext he craved, Sheriff Whitman lunged forward. In one swift motion, he tackled General Bryant to the ground, her polished uniform brushing against damp grass. The congregated veterans and uniformed officers recoiled in horror as Angela's cheek pressed into the cool, dew-speckled soil. Before she could protest, Whitman had twisted her arms behind her back, his knee driving into her ribcage to pin her flat. A staccato click punctuated the chaos as the sheriff snapped a pair of handcuffs onto Angela's wrists. The metal cuffs glinted under the rising sun, a stark contrast to the bright colors of her medals. Around them, mourners cried out in outrage. Some rushed forward, only to be halted by the deputy's raised rifle. Cameras whirred as reporters struggled for a clear shot, broadcasting live the image of a decorated general being subdued at her daughter's funeral. The cemetery moments earlier, so serene, had become a tableau of fear and confusion. Veterans who had stood in formation now huddled together, uncertain whether to intervene. The sense of dread was palpable. A high-ranking officer whose life had been defined by leadership and discipline was now treated as a criminal in her own moment of mourning. Through it all, Angela did not resist. Her strength lay in her refusal to escalate the violence. With her face pressed to the earth and her dignity still intact, she bore the weight of injustice with the same quiet resolve that had carried her through battlefields far from home. Elijah Bryant's heart pounded as he sprinted across the gravels toward where his mother lay restrained. Clad in a crisp suit and tie, he looked every bit the civil rights attorney he had become. "Mom," he shouted, only to be met by the leveled barrels of riot-trained deputies. They formed an unyielding line between him and Brigadier General Angela Bryant, forcing him to halt. His outstretched hand trembled as he pleaded for mercy, but the uniformed officers pressed their rifles closer, eyes cold and unrelenting. Behind him, Walter Bryant Sr., a proud Tuskegee airman who had once soared above the skies of World War II, struggled to rise from his folding chair. At 85, his back was frail, yet his spirit remained unbroken. Seeing his daughter on the ground, assaulted in front of her daughter's grave, he attempted to stand. A gasp escaped him, but his legs buckled under the weight of shock and age. He collapsed backward, the funeral guests behind him crying out as they rushed to help his faltering frame. What had been a solemn ceremony to honor sacrifice had turned into a grotesque spectacle of abuse and betrayal. Veterans who once marched in lockstep now stood frozen in disbelief. The breeze that carried the scent of magnolias now seemed thick with injustice. Reporters scrambled for footage cameras rolling on the heart-wrenching scene, a grieving family torn apart by the very men sworn to uphold the law. Then, as if summoned by the collective gasp of the crowd, a sharp voice cut through the chaos. "That's enough." FBI Special Agent Michael Reed strode into view, his badge held aloft like a banner of federal authority. Flanked by plainclothes agents, he walked directly to the scuffle. "You are under federal arrest," he declared, tone ironclad. "Release General Bryant immediately." The uniformed deputies hesitated, uncertainty flickering in their eyes as Reed's words echoed across the cemetery. A tension crackled between local and federal power, and in that moment the mourners felt a renewed surge of hope. Though the path to justice would be long, they knew that today at least the law had swung back toward its true purpose, to protect, not to oppress. Sheriff Whitman's defiance was far from over. As Special Agent Reed's team secured General Bryant, Whitman squared his shoulders and raised his voice to challenge federal authority. "You think you can just stroll in here and override our county's law?" he barked, spinning on his heel to face both the FBI agents and the hushed crowd. His deputies rallied behind him, rifles slung over their shoulders, faces hardened by loyalty to a prejudice older than any statute. The governor's protective injunction held little weight in Whitman's worldview. He would maintain his grip on power by any means necessary. Witnesses exchanged troubled glances. Friends and family of fallen soldiers, once filled with respect for the sheriff's office, now felt a burning betrayal. The air shimmered with the promise of outrage. Social media would explode with footage of a decorated general humiliated at her daughter's funeral. Veteran groups would issue statements. Civil rights organizations would call for a federal inquiry. Whitman had unwittingly lit a nationwide fuse, transforming a local affront into a catalyst for protest and reform. Few remembered that just 3 days earlier, at Montgomery Regional Airport, Angela Bryant had already faced his brand of humiliation. Clad in the same neatly pressed blue uniform that bore the service stripes and full array of medals earned over decades, she presented her military ID and orders to TSA officers. Whitman, moonlighting as a screening supervisor, dismissed her documents as counterfeit. He ordered her to remove her dress jacket and stand exposed in front of strangers, scrutinizing each ribbon as if it were contraband. Passengers averted their eyes, recording the spectacle on shaky phones, unable to believe such treatment in an American airport. From that indignity in the departure lounge to the tragedy beneath the oaks at Crestview National Cemetery, the same dark thread wove through each encounter, a man empowered by badge and prejudice, determined to bend the law to his will. Yet with every act of cruelty, the call for justice grew louder. Whitman might have thought he could silence one grieving mother, but instead he had amplified her voice in the hearts of millions. General Bryant sat quietly near Gate 17 at Montgomery Regional Airport, her posture perfectly straight, every crease in her dress blues sharp and precise. The late morning sunlight glinted off the silver braid on her shoulder and the rows of ribbons adorning her chest. Around her, weary travelers shuffled past with carry-ons in hand, some stealing curious glances at the woman in full-dress uniform. An 8-year-old boy tugged at his mother's hand and stepped forward. "Thank you for your service, ma'am," he said, eyes wide as he looked up at her polished medals. Angela offered him a gentle smile, placing a gloved hand over her heart. For a brief moment, the weight of her sorrow felt lighter, buoyed by pure innocence. Then everything changed. Two men in dark blue TSA uniforms appeared at the front of the line, and between them stood Sheriff Brock Whitman, his badge tucked beneath a neatly pressed shirt. Without a word of introduction, he motioned brusquely. "Step aside, ma'am," he ordered, voice cool and authoritative. Before Angela could protest, he grasped her elbow and steered her away from the line. "May I see your papers?" he demanded, riffling through her orders and ID with exaggerated scrutiny. He called over two deputies, his loyal allies, who flanked Angela with hard stares. One by one, they examined every ribbon, every stripe on her uniform, as if hunting for forgery. "Where'd you earn these?" Whitman sneered. "Did you buy them online?" Nearby passengers watched in stunned silence. Cameras on phones clicked as onlookers debated whether to intervene. Few dared. Angela remained composed. "Sir, I have already cleared security in Atlanta," she said calmly, pulling out her military travel orders and TSA-approved credentials. "I request your supervisor." Whitman's lips curled into a mocking grin. "Oh, we'll process you," he said, tossing her documents back. "But first, remove your jacket." Humiliated, Angela obeyed without complaint, letting him inspect her ribbons once more, each symbol of her sacrifice reduced to a curiosity in his cynical eyes. As he released her, Whitman leaned close and whispered, so only she could hear, "Enjoy Crestview. This is my town now." With that, he strode away, leaving Angela to collect her jacket and her dignity among a crowd now aflame with outrage. Tension crackled in the sterile fluorescence of the airport terminal as civil authority and local power squared off one last time. Elijah Bryant, his attorney's instinct kicking, and pulled out his phone and leveled it at Sheriff Whitman, ready to document any further abuse. "Don't even think about it," Whitman snarled, stepping closer until his badge glinted in the overhead light. "Try to interfere and I'll have you locked up for obstruction." His deputies formed a tight semicircle, weapons slung but fingers twitching near triggers. General Angela Bryant remained calm between them. She placed a steadying hand on Elijah's arm and spoke softly, "Not here. Not now." Despite the insult to her uniform and the threat to her son, she refused to give Whitman the satisfaction of breaking her composure. With one final, controlled nod to Elijah, she turned and walked past the screening checkpoint. Every step measured every ribbon on her chest, a testament to decades of service. Behind her, Whitman watched with a cold smile. He waited until she stepped out of sight, then pulled a secure phone from his pocket. His voice dropped to a hiss as he spoke into the receiver. "Target confirmed. Bryant is through. Proceed with plan, Southern order." In that whispered moment, he revealed the truth. He answered not merely to local politics, but to a clandestine network calling themselves the Defenders of Southern Order, a group determined to keep trailblazing Black service members in their place. They saw Angela as just another grieving single mother, vulnerable and alone. They believed they could humiliate her, scare her back into silence. But Whitman had underestimated her. He did not know the battles she had won against tyrants in desert sands, against prejudice in high courts, and against despair in her own heart. The cost of his arrogance would be far greater than he ever imagined. As the sliding doors whispered shut behind Angela, a reckoning was already in motion. One that would expose the Defender's shadowy reach and honor the legacy of a general who refused to be intimidated. This story teaches us that true power does not reside in a weapon or a rank, but in steadfast resolve and belief in justice in the face of tyranny and prejudice. The profound message is that a single individual, even if only a grieving mother in her military dress uniform, can expose and unnerve an entire network of racism through courage alone. If you were in that position, you would likely continue to bring the truth to light, collaborate with federal agencies to file lawsuits against the perpetrators, engage human rights organizations, and use both imagery and testimony to unite millions of hearts, craving fairness. As for whether racism will be completely eradicated by 2050, it may be overly optimistic to believe that all barriers and biases will vanish merely through legislation. But this narrative demonstrates that change always begins with individuals who refuse to bow. And if each of us dares to speak out, organizes peaceful protests, and promotes education on equality, a new generation could witness real bridges built between communities. This journey is far from simple, yet it is precisely courage, solidarity, and unwavering faith in human dignity that will continue to kindle hope that despite ongoing challenges by 2050, racism in all its forms will have been significantly diminished and may even be fully abolished in places where justice truly prevails.